Well, my wife and I have been commissioned to write a book about one of the oldest organizations in the Yukon Order of Pioneers. They're celebrating their 130th anniversary this December, and they asked if we would write a book that covers the history of the order since its creation in 1894. Well, it was my first summer as curator of collections, so I was still kind of finding my way around. And I had already become aware that the old-timers in Dawson sort of had a blasé attitude about the history. And for example, they saw all these old buildings with all the stuff inside as an enticement for tourists. And they welcomed them there and said, help yourself, take them away. They thought that it would attract them there. And of course, there were collectors who came up and hauled truckloads of material away from Dawson City. And if they didn't lose the artifacts that way, they'd clean house and take all the stuff down and throw it in the river. So these films started popping out of the ground where they were planning to build a new recreation center. And it was brought to my attention, so I went down to take a look. And sure enough, there was all kinds of debris. It wasn't just reels of film. There were old broken curling rocks, skates, chicken wire, bottles. It looked like a dog's breakfast. And I was able to look at the films and determined that they were relatively intact. You could unspool them and you could still see the images. So I thought, well, the typical attitude here is take it and throw it in the river. And I thought, no, there's got to be something better. And I started phoning around. And fortunately, I got in contact with Sam Kula, who was the director of the National Film Archives. Now, Sam was interested. He could see the potential. And he said, but I need a little bit more information. So he said, send me a little bit more detail on what you're finding. So I went back to the site a few days later, and I sampled the material there and described the contents on some of the reels and the condition they were in. And I said, potential for hundreds more. And the next thing I know, I'm getting a telex from Sam Kula saying, I'm on my way, I'm arriving on the 25th of July, please book me a room in a hotel for 2 nights. And so he came up, and I picked him up at the airport, we went directly to the site and started, I had a shovel with me, and we were digging around, poking at things and examining this material. And I also took him out to the Bear Creek Industrial Complex, about 6 miles out of Dawson, and they had an old root cellar there where they were storing all the films that had already been recovered. So he already had a sense that there was a large volume of film that was being dug up. And we got the Dawson Museum involved, brought the director of the museum over to the site, and between the 3 of us, we worked out a plan for how these films could be recovered. The Dawson Museum took over at that point, and they collected and cataloged the films. And when they sent the list of 525 titles to Sam Kula in Ottawa in September of 1978, he started issuing press releases, and it went global. The announcement of the discovery seemed to pique everybody's interest, and we got responses and news coverage from all over the world. So that's how the film was found. On the 11th, we had to get it to Ottawa, and that posed some problems because it was nitrate film, very flammable, very dangerous. Greyhound wouldn't handle it. Commercial hauling firms wouldn't handle it. The airlines wouldn't touch it. How were we going to get it there? And I was about ready to rent a truck and drive to Ottawa with the films when it was suggested by one of my colleagues that the military handles stuff like that all the time. So Sam Kula got in touch with the Department of National Defense, and they brought a Hercules into Whitehorse, loaded 2 large containers, probably a ton or more of this film, into a Hercules, and they flew it directly to Rockcliffe Air Force Base in Ottawa. And of course, at that point, the National Film Archives took over the project. They actually developed a technique for stabilizing these films, a technique that had never been used before. So It took them about 10 days to figure out the best way to do it, which in itself is a remarkable accomplishment for a government organization. And they recovered the films, and they've been featured in various ways, including film by New York filmmaker Bill Morrison, who produced a film called Dawson City, Frozen Time. And so it was partly his interest in the thing that rekindled my interest. By that time, Sam Kula had passed away, and there were a lot of people telling stories about the film find that were grossly distorted. And I kind of took offense from that, and I thought, since I was one of the last few surviving people who were involved in discovering the film, I'd write a book about it. And along the way, I started asking questions about, well, when did the first movie appear in Dawson City? And so a little research for that, and how did they transform from the odd novelty moving picture to movie houses showing films on a regular basis. And that involved putting it into the context of the vibrant theater world in Dawson during and just after the gold rush that eventually it petered out, and moving pictures filled the void. And I traced the history of movie theaters in Dawson up until the discovery of the films in 1978. Well, there were some remarkable people who participated in the gold rush. It was a very exciting time, and one of them was a fellow named Sid Grauman, and a consummate showman in his own way. And he produced, well, he didn't produce the films, but he had several large theaters, including Grauman's Chinese Theater. People who are familiar with Grauman know that they used to have the Oscar awards presented in Grauman's Chinese Theater, and that's the one where they have all the footprints and the autographs in cement out front. And Alexander Pantages, who developed a string of movie houses all across the West Coast. There was one in Winnipeg. He started out as a bartender in Dawson City. And of course there were some, William Desmond Taylor was, he was a timekeeper for the Yukon Gold Company. But when he left the Yukon, he got into films and started performing. He was an actor, and then he became a director. And he was one of the prominent directors in Hollywood until he was murdered in 1922. And there was a young lady who appeared in Dawson with a theater troupe. Her name was Marjorie Rambeau. And amongst the people in that theater troupe was a fellow named Roscoe Arbuckle, better known as Fatty Arbuckle, who went on to become one of Hollywood's big names in the silent era. And by the time they got to Dawson, the wheels fell off the bus, metaphorically. And she was stranded in Dawson for a year, and during that time she put on amateur stage productions, and that sort of was the bread and butter that allowed her and her mother to survive until they left the following year. She went on to a stellar career on stage and in Hollywood. She was twice nominated for Oscars for her performances, and she performed with some of the greats like Clark Gable and Ronald Reagan, John Wayne, Spencer Tracy. Just one, she was in the upper echelon of Hollywood glitterati. So, and there are some others. There was one fellow who was born in Dawson, went into film later. His name was Victor Jory. He was the voice of the Shadow on radio, and he was Helen Keller's father in the movie The Miracle Worker. And then he went in, he starred on a detective series on TV as well. So it seems that the gold rush lured people there who had a sense for the excitement, opportunity, and they learned a lot about what audiences wanted. Maybe it was mostly live theater in Dawson at the time, but they took those experiences away with them, and they carried them with them through the rest of their lives. When they featured Charlie Chaplin's film in Grauman's, and they had a big stage production before the curtains parted to show the film. And they also showed a silent film about Robert Service's book, The Trail of '98. And that was, I think that was the last film that was shown in Grauman's Theatre before he converted to the talkies. So, you know, I try to imagine some of these people getting together and talking about their times in Dawson City during the gold rush, and what they must have talked about and how much fun they must have had. Well, I was approaching a point where I had 35 years working with Parks Canada and the National Museum. So I had an opportunity to retire, and I started thinking about that before I retired and developed a 5-year plan. And one of the things was to start writing. So I approached the Yukon News and had a lunch meeting with the editor at the time, Richard Mostyn. And he liked the idea, and he said we could do it weekly. And he said, well, how many articles do you think you've got? And I said, well, I think I could keep it up for a year or so. And that was 17 years ago. And he said, well, what will you call it? And I thought a little bit, and I know that in my younger days, I would go out searching for places that had some historical significance, even if that meant strapping on a backpack and hiking there, and it would take a week to do so. And when I was in Dawson, my wife and I would go out and camp in the gold fields, and I'd go out and record all the old workings from the gold rush that were still out there. So I said, why don't we call it The History Hunter? And he liked the idea, and that became the title for my column. And I'm still writing The History Hunter today.